Welcome everyone to the next lecture in Introduction to Psychology. Again, this is the fourth edition of your textbook by Charles Stanger and Sue France. This has been brought to you by Flat World, and we will be covering Chapter 4 in this recording, Sensation and Perception, Experiencing the World Around Us. This is Part 1. All right. So we sense and perceive the world around us through sensation, transduction, perception. Sensation, we talked about this in the last lecture, which is just receiving stimuli from our sense organs, our pain, touch, pain, touch, vision, all that stuff. Transduction, this is where that you convert that stimuli that's been detected by some receptor in your body, some receptor cell, and it gets converted to electrical impulses transported to the brain. This is the same thing that happens in sensors with electronic circuits. And then the third part is perception, right? There's an organization and interpretation of these sensations by the brain. So how we perceive these things is going to definitely affect how we respond to them. All right. The learning objectives for this section 4.1 are to review and summarize the capacities and limitations of human sensation, and 2, to explain the difference between sensation and perception and describe how psychologists measure sensory and difference thresholds. Okay, so when we're talking about measuring sensation, we hinted on this in the last chapter, but we have an area called psychophysics. And this is a branch of psychology that studies the effects of physical stimuli on sensory perceptions and mental states. And then we have values such as the absolute threshold, which is the intensity of a stimulus that allows an organism to just barely detect it. A good example for this would be in engineering. It's called electrical safety. And what we do is, again, with psychologists, is that we look at the minimum perceptible detection of leakage current on devices. So that's everything from your toaster, your refrigerator, your washer dryer, and then in the medical field, in my area, we focus on all the medical equipment. Right. So what is that basic, tiny, the minimum amount of threshold that a person can feel? And then this actually does change between patients and the average person in the population. Because remember, the patient population is someone who might be compromised already in the system. So if they're at the hospital, they're not feeling well, their physiology might be different, and their threshold of perception may be different from someone who is not ill. Right? So these things do change based on a lot of environmental factors. So just to kind of put that point to rest, someone who is in a hospital, and let's say they have a bad case of the flu and they're hospitalized, that actually changes the skin impedance. So it actually changes the effect of that current traveling through the body. So it can be a little bit more dangerous for them. So we do have to always go for the most strictest threshold when we talk about absolute threshold. But in this class, we're going to just start off talking about the normal threshold for everyone who's, just say, someone who's not feeling ill or sick. Believe it or not, if you stay up for 2 or 3 days at a time, it's just like being sick, and that'll actually affect your absolute thresholds as well. So let's go ahead and start off with getting into detail on signal detection analysis, and this is pertaining to psychology. There's a lot of parallels to electrical engineering and signal detection analysis there, but I'll refrain from jumping into that. We're going to talk about sensitivity and response bias, so there is definitely something called sensitivity in electrical engineering. But signal detection analysis, so when we're talking about psychology or biopsychology, you can think of it like when you're playing a game where you need to listen carefully for a special beep or sound, and there's a lot of other noise around you. So like there's people talking, there's music playing, and just a bunch of other audio, distractions. And your job is to figure out when you hear the beep, and when you don't. Think of it like those hearing tests that you used to take when you were younger, except for there, you were in a quiet room. Here, we're actually intentionally putting distraction. So what is a signal detection analysis? It's like a science game that helps us understand how well you can tell the difference between that special beep, that signal that we're injecting into the experiment, and all of the noise in the experiment, so background noise. It's just a way to see how good your ears and your brain are at this particular task. And this will measure two things. There's more tests than this, but this is one test. And we look at the sensitivity and we look at any response bias. So sensitivity just means that we look at how good you really are at hearing the beep sound, even when there's a lot of noise. And again, a good example would be if you have high sensitivity, you can hear the beep clearly even when there's loud music playing. And if you have low sensitivity, you might miss the beep because the music's too loud. You might even miss the beep in a quiet room. That's just kind of due to aging. Response bias, this just means that it's how often you say, yes, I heard the beep, even if you're not sure. Right? So this is not a positive result. I know the beep is there. You sort of like took a guess. An example would be if you have a strong response bias, you might say, yes, I heard the beep a lot, even if sometimes you didn't really hear it. So if you have a weak response bias, you only say yes when you're absolutely sure you heard the beep. And if you have a strong response bias, you're not going to say yes to every time you thought you heard the beep. When we put all this together, again, imagine you're in that noisy room and there's a machine that makes a quiet beep. Your job is to raise your hand every time you hear that beep. When we talked about sensitivity, it means you have good sensitivity that you'll raise your hand almost every time the machine beeps. And if there's a lot of talking and other noise, you'll distinguish it. And review of response bias or summary, it's just saying that you might raise your hand even when you think you might have heard the beep, but you're not sure. So weak response bias, you'll raise your hand more often. Strong response bias, you won't. You'll be more accurate. And this is important because you want to understand sensitivity and response bias to figure out how good people are detecting important signals in various situations like hearing tests or detecting certain smells. It's also used to design better equipment, making sure people can use it effectively. And it's just a cool way to see how well you can detect important signals in a noisy world. And how you behave when you're not sure if you detected them or not. There is a dilemma in the medical field. This has to do with medical instrumentation, and it has to do with what's called alarm fatigue. And this normally happens to patient caregivers, nurses, nursing assistants, that whole group who are in and out of patient rooms. If you've ever been in an ICU, you'll hear beeps and alarms going off continuously, aperiodically, meaning there is no set time. They just happen because people are experiencing different things at different times. And what alarm fatigue is, it's a phenomenon where a clinician, say a nurse, most likely the nurses because they're there most often, the doctors are not. So the nurses will be in the room, an alarm will be going off or on, and you may actually be observing the whole situation. You hear the alarm and you see the nurse just working on paperwork, doing something, and you're wondering why the nurse is waiting so long to address the alarm. It's actually because of alarm fatigue. They start tuning out the alarm. And so this is a really big issue in healthcare, specifically in ICUs, where those alarms mean something critical. We need to find a better way to come up with designs for medical devices. This is where clinical engineering psychology comes into play. The clinical engineering psychology of signal detection analysis for alarm fatigue. Again, it's a huge problem. It's a global problem, and so far I've not been able to give it enough time to come up with a few solutions. But this sounds like a very good activity for our homework. So when measuring the sensation, right, we have possible trial outcomes when you have the stimulus and when the perceiver responds. And you're going to have different combinations, right? Whether it's present, absent, whether they responded yes or no, and whether that was correct or not correct. So I wonder if there's a game that already exists where you can sort of or a toy that already exists where you can actually play a game of this, right? So if you're playing a game and you have to listen for some beep or some sound, sometimes the beep is there, sometimes it's not, and then your job is to tell whether the beep is there or not. And so in this game, it would help us understand how well you can sense things around you. It might even be a good experiment to work out for the clinical alarm fatigue syndrome that's people experience out there in the healthcare field. Right? So you can have different possible outcomes for this game. I kind of summarized it before, but there are 4 possible outcomes, and that's based on whether the beep actually is there or not, and then how you responded to it, whether it was there or not. So one, you hit the response saying the stimulus was present, and yes, it actually was. So you say, I hear the beep is actually there. Again, that's just saying that you correctly raised your hand because you heard it. So if you look at the picture there, the top left corner, that's quadrant 2 in this quadrant diagram, where things are correct and you're answering correctly. So that's good. You see the 2 green ones. The green at the very bottom, correct rejection. So that means that you didn't hear the beep, and there is no beep. There actually is no beep, and you don't hit the buzzer or you don't raise your hand because you didn't hear anything. So you're also correct down there in the bottom right. Yes, it was present, or no, you rejected it. It was not present. It was absent. And those are good. And then we have the other 2 categories. Where it was present, but you didn't hit the button or raise your hand, so you missed it. And where it wasn't present, but you hit the button thinking it was, and you created a false alarm. So yeah, the first one is I don't hear the beep when the beep is actually there. So you don't do anything, you don't raise your hand, or you don't hit the buzzer, but there's something actually going on. So alarm fatigue, we could actually navigate using this chart to plot where we think alarm fatigue might be present, right? So there was an alarm, but they don't actually hear it. We want to know what's happening there with alarm fatigue. And so what happens is you get a false alarm, right? Or not a false alarm, but you miss an alarm. So the false alarm when it's absent, but you hit yes, right? So you think you heard a beep, but there actually wasn't any. You raise your hand, you hit the buzzer, you hit the nurse call button, whatever it is, but there was nothing there. So you get this false alarm. And this is what's called stimulus versus perceiver response. It's what happens when the beep, whatever it is, or whatever stimulus is present or not, and how you perceived it to be and how you responded. So stimulus present, you hit. You don't sense it. Sorry, the stimulus is present and you sense it, and you hit the button. The stimulus is present and you don't sense it, means you missed it. When the stimulus is not present, but you think you sensed it, you get a false alarm. And then when it's not present and you also don't sense it because it's not actually there, that's correct rejection. So very good outline for maybe tackling our medical device alarm fatigue problem that's happening out in the world. So again, this is important because on the average population, on the average person, not talking about the healthcare specifically, it teaches us how people perceive things around them. So it shows us how good people are at detecting signals, like sounds in this case, and it helps us improve things like hearing tests, safety alarms. So when you play this beep game, what you'll do is you'll help scientists understand how people sense and respond to different signals. The hits and the correct rejections are good because they show you sense that beep correctly or the alarm correctly, while misses and false alarms, these are mistakes, and this is where we have to learn how we can improve either sensing our abilities for training, or how engineers can actually meet the individual halfway by creating a different system, specifically in the medical field, to mitigate the alarm fatigue. All right, so I think I found my homework question for this week. Now here, again, continuing with measuring sensation, where we talk about difference threshold and Weber's law. So difference threshold is just noticeable difference, or J&D is what it says there, just noticeable. So you notice the first difference. So again, imagine you're playing a video game, the sound's turned on. The difference threshold is like the smallest change in the gain's volume that you can notice. So if the gain's volume is at level 5 and someone changes it to level 5.1, the difference threshold is that point where you barely start to hear the difference in the volume. Who does this? Directors do this with scary movies, right? So you're watching a movie and it's got this music, all of a sudden the music gets slightly more intense, and they keep cranking it up a tiny bit, hopefully to the point where you can't sense it, but by the time you know it, you went from 5 to 5.5, and you missed 5.1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but had been increasing in intensity the whole time. They're trying to build that, what did Alfred Hitchcock call it, the suspense, right? But in actuality, there is continuity in the story and in the music, and you might actually be detecting it, but not noticing the difference until it's at a certain volume, because you're so busy looking at the movie. So again, you're listening to music. Now, if you have the volume at 10 all the way up, and you turn it up just a tiny bit more, you may not notice a difference because you're sort of like saturated, or you may be, so until you get to that just noticeable difference. Weber's law, this is something that tells us an interesting thing about that difference threshold. It says that the amount of change you can just barely notice, that J&D, depends on how strong the original signal is. So the bigger the initial sound, the bigger the change needs to be for you to notice it. So imagine you hear a very powerful sound, loud sound, and you increase it slightly, or the volume of it, you increase the volume slightly. You need to actually change that proportion a little more in intensity so you can notice a difference, is what it's saying. Versus if you had like again a spooky sound and then you start off very lightly, the slight differences in change you'll be able to detect easier. So starting off with your music at level 2, you'll notice that small change in 2.5, 3, and so forth. But if you start your music at something super loud, 10, 11, 12, and you crank it up 2 or 3 more points, you might not hear anything at all. Try this when you're actually on your headphones. Don't put your headphones on and crank it to the volume that you normally would listen to it. Put your headphones on, whatever you're listening to, and start off with the lowest possible sound that you can just barely hear the singer. If you're listening to a podcast, the point where you can just barely hear the individual narrating, and then crank it up in tiny increments, and then notice how comfortable that will be for you with something very much smaller volume versus something at a very high volume, right? Sometimes you'll listen to something directly jumping to that like a mid-range volume, and any noise around you, if you're one of those people who walks at the grocery store and you have your headphones on, the grocery store gets a little loud, so you need to compensate for that. So you start increasing the volume, and all of a sudden that thing is way past 70 dB or maybe 100 something dB, and you're causing hearing damage. But if you started off very low, and that's within the store, and you're hearing all the noise at the same time, where you can barely hear it, and just start cranking it slowly until it gets to a comfortable level where you can hear it and you attune to it, you'll be at a much lower number than had you started off at that larger number. So I'm one of those people. I like to walk in stores with my Bluetooth on, and that's what Weber's law is all about. It's to help us understand how much of a change is needed for us to sense it. So depending on that, it depends on that original signal level. This can be applied to other things, but we'll leave it here to this sound. And I was going to talk about something in economics. So imagine you drive a very expensive car. You grew up in a wealthy family, and you get a car that's just slightly better, the newer model. But to you, it's not a big deal because you don't sense that difference from the original that you had versus someone who maybe took the bus and they can finally afford their first used car that probably makes a lot of noise and has some issues with it. For them, that difference is going to be huge. Okay. Weaver's law. All right. Blind sight. This is seeing without knowing. That's the quickest way to say it. So imagine you're a superhero with a special power, and it's called blind sight, right? So this will actually make a good superhero. So even though you can't actually see things in the usual way, you can still sense or you can feel what's around you. And it's like having this hidden superpower that helps you know things without actually seeing them. So this is pretty much how it works. You have a condition where some people have where their eyes work, but their brain doesn't process the visual information in the way that makes them consciously aware of what they're seeing. So I've seen a couple of videos, and I'm not sure if this might be a good example, where this could be actually a cognitive and not a perception or an awareness thing, where people will go to Yellowstone Park and they see the bison, and they're huge animals. The males are huge. If you've ever seen a bull in Texas, a cow, not a cow, but a bull, and you go closer to the fence, you'll see the huge difference between a bull and a cow. And bison are no different. The males are huge and they're scary just by sight alone. But people will walk right up to them, start taking selfies, and they're very territorial and they're extremely protective of their herd. So just Google this and you'll see tons and tons of stories about people who got mauled by a bison here in the US. And this might not be a good example, but it comes to mind. It's like, what are they thinking when they're walking up to this huge animal, right? It could be blind sight. We can talk about this in class. But it's like the brain gets that visual signal. They see this very, very large, dangerous animal. They are tiny compared to the animal. Even the largest guy could be standing next to the animal, and the animal would just toss them like nothing. But these are normally women who go up there with the phone, stand next to it, and they're very, very tiny, and the animal ends up charging. Right? Another thing you don't want to do with bison, just to complete that whole thing, is you never want to cross the path of one of these protective animals. So that goes for bulls as well. You don't cross their path. If you're walking down a park and they tell you that there's bison, they're allowed to run free there, and all of a sudden you're walking across a trail and you see a bison on the side of the trail, do not cross its path. Right? It's going to feel that it's being cornered, so you just turn around and go the other way. I've seen this video as well where people will cross the path of a bull or cross the path of a bison, and it looks like it's not doing anything, but the minute you cross it starts feeling like it's being cornered because you came from one direction. It knows it doesn't want to go that direction, and now it knows that you've covered the other direction, and it'll charge you. So just a little bit of advice: do not cross the paths of these animals. That goes for predators as well. Turn around, go the other way. If it means going a long, long way, go the other way, or you'll find yourself in the hospital. So with these people is that they can't so even though they can't see say the face in a normal sense, when someone's like making an expression and trying to show them that, hey, what you're doing is not right. So I'm talking about people, not bison. If you ask them what emotion the face is showing, they might guess something wrong. They might say, oh, this is fear, but it's something else, right? So it's like having a hidden part of their brain that still knows what's going on, even if they're not aware of it. So a good analogy would be you're playing a video game with your eyes closed, but you have a special controller that vibrates when there's an enemy nearby. You can't see the enemy on the screen, but you can still sense where they are because of the vibrations. And that's kind of similar to how blind sight works, right? So the person can't see the visual information, but their brain still gets clues about what's happening. So that whole thing I mentioned with the bison is probably just the opposite of that. They're not blind sight. They are. I'll just kind of give you an opposite example this whole time. They can see. No, I still think I can make that work. Right? The animal's large. The animal is, in some cases, it's huffing, or it's, you can see it agitated. But no, in that case, I think we'd be talking about the rest of people. Even if someone who can't see that visual information, but they still sense that there's something wrong. The people who go to Yellowstone Park and they see the actual cues and they ignore them, I think that's not blind sight. I'm sorry, that's something else. But it's a good contrast to what blind sight is. So remember, that is not blind sight, now that I think about it. So what blind sight does, it shows us that our brains are doing a lot of work behind the scenes. Even if we're not aware of it, our brains can pick up and process information. It helps us understand the world in ways we might not even realize. So it's like having this secret superpower where you can see things without actually seeing them. You sense that something is wrong. Unlike the Yellowstone bison bull analogy that I gave you, that's not blind sight, now that I'm thinking about it. It's hard to explain. They don't see the danger. Yeah. What would you call that? Politely. What would you call that politely? Okay. I won't spend too much time on that because this is lecture and this is a recording. All right. So that's it. We're done with the first section. And I'm not going to start reading these takeaways. I'm just going to let you, there in the slide, you can read them. So I won't read slides to you. And that's three first takeaways, and then another 3 takeaways from this section. And I want to thank you for your time, and this video will be posted soon.